There's an essay that was published in 1995 titled Industrial Society and Its Future. I think it's an excellent explanation of what industrial society has done to us and is doing to us and why things happen the way they do. My only criticism of this essay is that it seems to begin by labeling or critiquing a certain group or type of person, even though it then goes on to explain that the confines and consequences of modern industrial society are the causes of the behaviors of that group of people. I still feel like by starting out pointing out those people, it puts that reader on a defensive posture or makes people feel like it's an attack or something. And it's such a great explanation that I feel like everybody needs to know about it. So what I want to do here is I want to expand on and highlight and discuss some of the bigger, more important topics in that essay. Not everything in it, but certain things. And I want to start by exploring and explaining the why and how of the industrial society forcing people into particular groups in a way that hopefully doesn't sound as critical or inflammatory about the people who end up in those groups, because modern society is what's doing it to them. So the essay it was about industrial society. This page or channel is about industrial society. So what does an industrial society do to individual humans? There's several things. We're going to start by picking one of the subtitles or topics in that essay, and it is sources of social problems. Now, there are a couple of big main underlying sources of our social problems, but one of the two or three main ones is the fact that modern industrial society requires us to live under conditions that are just radically different from those under which we evolved, like caveman and primitive man conditions. For the primitive man, social change came very slow, or it didn't happen at all. He lived amongst the same small group or family or tribe in the same general area and the same general conditions for his entire life. But in modern industrial society, change and social change is much more rapid, and it breaks down those natural small-scale communities and families and tribes because man has been forced to move away to college and to move from rural natural areas to large metro areas for jobs and housing and education. So we're now more crowded. There's more people and we live in more large metro areas. So we're more crowded and we have more modern technology. And the modern technology puts disruptive powers into people's hands when we're already in a crowded situation. So I'm thinking about in the modern environment where I live, loud car exhaust and leaf blowers, and I go hiking or to the beach and people are playing loud music. Well, if these things are restricted, then the people doing those things are frustrated and aggravated. And if these things are not restricted, well then people like me are frustrated and aggravated. And that's a prime example of how in the modern industrial society or even the big government system, there's just a no-win situation. You've got opposing groups of people. Some people want one thing, some people want another thing, and there's just no way to make a ruling that is going to satisfy everyone. So another thing about modern society, for the primitive man, slow changing natural world he lived in provided him with stability and some sense of security, because again, things were the same his whole or most of his life. So he had a sense of stability, of security, or a sense of home in a way. But in the modern world, it's not nature dominated, it's man who dominates nature, and man's technology causes rapid changes, and that leaves us feeling unstable and like we don't have a good solid foundation of home. Also in modern society, the individual's loyalty must be to the system, because if his loyalty were to the small scale community, then that community is going to serve its own interests and take its own path. And that's going to be at odds with the system. The system can't have that. The system has to have everybody participating. That's why, there's so many of us who are desperately trying to be self-sufficient and grow our own food and be off-grid and buy and sell and trade and barter foods and goods in small-scale communities. And the system purposefully makes it so difficult for us to do that with laws and rules and regulations and crazy stuff. If we all stopped buying from the big grocery store chain and growing our own food, then those big chains would go out of business, and the shipping and trucking companies would suffer, and big ag that grows the food would suffer, and many big businesses and banking systems would slow down, and it would be far too disruptive to the financial part of the industrial system, the industrial society, and it'd be at odds with what corporate lobbyists are paying and using money to control our lawmakers and the laws. So they can't have us doing our own thing. We have to be part of the system. When we did live in small communities, like caveman times, or even more recently in the 19th century, the 1800s, when there was the American frontier, any big changes were usually created by those people living in those situations. And they were usually for some good or survival type reasons. The indigenous peoples or the American Indians would follow the buffalo around, and they would move their camps to different areas and different seasons for weather. But they would do that for their own good and their own survival. It wasn't forced on them by someone else. Well, until the white man came along, obviously. But for modern man, these big changes are imposed on him against his will. He has no choice. Change is imposed on him. And one of the things I can think of right now as I sit here in South Florida is, I've got all these 5G cell phone towers and Starlink satellites that I'm forced to live amongst. It's entirely against my will. It's without my consent. And there's not a thing I can do about it. I have no recourse. I can't stop 5G. I can't stop satellites. There's nothing I can do about it. So change is forced on me. And we didn't evolve having change forced on us. We evolved in stable settings where we made changes that were in our own individual self-interest. Another forced change 100, 150 years ago, when automobiles were new and upcoming. You didn't have to have one when they were new. But as the Industrial Revolution progressed and we became more urbanized, then stores and shops and supplies started moving to big cities, and jobs started moving to big cities, and it just started becoming, as more and more people used automobiles and that type of transportation, the system changed to where the society, the environment, everything about our landscape changed to where if you didn't have an automobile, you couldn't participate and get to the stores and supplies and jobs and housing that you needed. So even though you may not have wanted a car when they first were introduced, you eventually had to have one to fit into society. Now, I know there's little pockets of big urban areas, New York City and London, where you can live in the city and not have a car. But for the majority of Americans anyway, you kind of have to have a car whether you ever wanted one or not. Most people my age, we've been on the internet and social media long enough to see that we don't want to do this anymore. We want away from internet life. We want to get back to nature, and we don't want social media. We want real life interaction with people like we had when we were teenagers. Well, it's difficult to do that because you can't keep track of your family members or your nephews or whatever if you're not on social media, because you don't get to talk to them anymore because we're not in small communities like we used to be. And I'm an individual veterinarian, so I'm basically a one-person small business. Well, if I'm not on social media or using internet for email, then my business doesn't survive. So I have to do these things even though I so desperately want to get away from it. It's because it's part of the industrial society system that you have to do what everybody else is doing to fit in. You're forced to do it or you get left behind. And I know many of us here want to be left behind, but we don't get left behind in the way we want. We don't get left behind out on some homestead living free. These things are still imposed upon us. So as many podcasters and authors and journalists and people like Whitney Webb comes to mind, they've been pointing out to us over the past several years that our system, another rapid modern technological change is we're becoming cashless. Everything is going to be digital and traceable. So that those of us who still like direct, personal, private cash transactions between individuals, or we want to use cash in an effort to support a small local business, we're just going to have more and more difficulty doing so until we're forced to not be able to do that anymore. So all of these technological advances and many, many others, they've been forced on us by the modern industrial society. And they're always advertised as being good for us. It's propagandized as being an improvement or necessary or beneficial. Cars, cell phone communication, all these things, digital currency is going to, fix so many things that aren't even broken. All these things always end up being bad for us. Everything always ends up being bad for us. We can all see that. So anyway, that's kind of just the topic of sources of social problems. And there's a few other main sources of social problems that we'll discuss in the future. Thanks.